I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of Australia and their connections to land, sea, sky, and community. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today.
Hello, my love, and welcome to the April and Fritz podcast. I am so happy that you are here. Thank you again so much for being here and spending this time with me. As I always say, I am forever grateful, to you for listening and spending your earbud time with me. I know that there are a million other podcasts out there that you could be listening to, but, you have chosen to listen to this one today. So I am extremely grateful. As you know, our podcast really kind of broadly explores the skill and the soul behind floral design and how to create unforgettable events. But what we know about events is that they don't always go to plan. Things can go wrong, and so today we'll be diving into the topic of insurance. We want your event to be unforgettable for all of the right reasons. Insurance maybe isn't the sexiest topic, not as sexy maybe as designing and flowers and all of the other, fun and exciting stuff that goes into planning an event. But as you'll hear today, it is extremely important. And so I'm really pleased to have the lovely Casey from Sparksure joining us today to talk through the topic of insurance. Casey has been part of the insurance world now for over 11 years, and she holds a diploma of insurance broking services. And in the early years of her career in 2012, she was actually awarded with the Australian and New Zealand Institute of Insurance and Financial Young Insurance Professional of the Year award. And that is quite the mouthful. So I'm just going to say the Young Insurance Professional of the Year award. Her business is Sparksure, and Sparksure is on a mission to eliminate the stress and confusion that insurance tends to bring to business owners. They help business owners navigate through all of the different types of, insurance policies and companies and complicated kind of terminology. And so I know that you might be wondering, what exactly has this got to do with me as a client? But as you'll hear today, Casey is really breaking down what kinds of insurances your vendors in the event space should have in place, why this is in the best interest of you, the client, and how to bring it up with potential vendors, along with, so much more. And what we know to be true with insurance is that you don't need it until you need it. And so the goal of this episode is to really get you on the front foot and ensure that you have quality vendors with appropriate insurances so that your event can be one that gets spoken about for all of the right reasons. So before we get stuck into things, just a little general advice warning. Please be aware that the content of this podcast episode is general advice and not personal advice. Sparksure can tell you about the relevant products and can collect information from you to determine if we can arrange the product or cover for you. However, Sparksure are not able to tell you if the product or an option within it is specifically appropriate for you, having regard to your objectives, financial situation, or needs. Because of this, you need to consider the appropriateness of the general advice given in regards to your personal situation before acting upon it. Lastly, as you know, I don't run ads on this podcast, so the only way it grows is by you liking and subscribing to the show. So go ahead and give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Let's get into it. Welcome to the podcast, Casey. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be chatting in a bit of a different perspective to what I'm used to.
Absolutely. A lot of people will probably be thinking, why do we have an insurance broker on a floristry podcast? So I think we've got a lot to chat about today. And what I really love about this conversation is that it's going to kind of be one that isn't at the forefront of people's minds, I suppose. So I'm really curious to pick your brain about a lot of different things. But as a starting point, why don't you kind of introduce yourself, share a little bit about you, your business, and kind of how this kind of came to be?
For sure. So my name is Casey Fenton. I am the founder and managing director of Sparksure. So we work with business owners to help them arrange their insurances to protect, that business, lifestyle and future. So how Sparksure sort of came about. It's a little bit of a long story, but I'll try and keep it as short and sweet as possible. I first started in insurance all the way back in 2009. Fast forward to 2015, and I had what I like to call my early life crisis and decided to leave insurance and go into the health and wellness space, which I was on that journey for about 2.5 years. And then I actually rejoined the insurance industry in late 2018. And it was that year that I had my aha moment, which was probably the first little stepping stone in my journey to launching Sparksure. So I realized that, where I was working, there was a real misalignment between this particular client that I was helping with their insurance and the actual organization that I was working with. So that's where I identified a bit of a gap in the market. I then set out on a journey to start providing insurance services that are more aligned to the millennial business owner. And then fast forward to 2023, and I launched Sparksure, and here I am today.
Amazing. I love that. And it's so funny because I think, like, obviously you've had the experience of being a business owner as well as being on the other side of being the insurance broker. So I think you probably have quite a unique perspective.
Absolutely. The last 12 months have been an absolute journey. We were obviously just having a little conversation before we started recording and talking about how different it is to being, an employee within an industry to then, launching your own business and just having so many extra things to think about on top of, the day-to-day tasks of providing your service or, selling your products.
100%. Okay. So as we know, this podcast is really around like clients or kind of potential clients who are thinking about, running events in really any capacity, really. So weddings, funerals, or whatever it may be, everything in between.
Yes.
So as a client specifically, why does insurance kind of matter? Like what should they be aware of, and what should they be kind of considering when they're thinking about insurance?
For sure. I think it's definitely not something that is front of mind, but it would be something that I would suggest, to ensuring that vendors do have insurance in place. It's, first and foremost, it's a very good indicator that you're dealing with a professional, because they are thinking about, beyond just providing the service or selling the product to you. They're thinking about, what could potentially go wrong when they're providing that service or providing that product for you. So it means that they are, putting good measures in place to ensure, the safety of others and the well-being of others, and ensuring that they've got a backup plan if something does go wrong or if they do make a mistake.
100%. And I think if anybody has ever been in the events industry, or if anybody has ever even just run an event, that things go wrong. Like, it's just part of the deal, right? And so,
I mean, I've run some events in the last couple of years, and I've always got extra help on board to help me with the running of those events. And I always say to them, like, I don't know how you do it, because the curveballs that are thrown your way throughout the whole process, I mean, even if you're not a professional organizing event, I think back to organizing, birthdays and other sorts of celebrations myself without, engaging any third-party vendors. And it is stressful because you've got, things that change at the last minute, numbers changing, all those sorts of things. So there's a lot to juggle.
100%. And honestly, I think I should just do another episode on like things that go wrong, the things that have gone wrong, because innately just the way events run, I think that there's so much room and margin for error, and so much room and margin for human error specifically, because, especially when you have, say, one person who's doing it all, right? Like the chances of something happening, and that's what we kind of talk a lot about with insurance, is that idea of risk. So, which we'll get into a little bit later. But I think that it's quite obvious that having insurance, obviously benefits the vendor, as it's designed to protect their business,
Correct.
So how does having insurance or that coverage in place actually benefit the client directly?
Well, if you are organising an event, you obviously are going to have, friends, family, might be a corporate event, other business owners attending the event. So it means that in the event that someone is, injured, property is damaged, or a mistake is made of some sort that impacts another person and, could potentially, cause them to have a financial loss, or as I said, an injury or damage to their property, you know that when that unfortunate event occurs, that vendor that you've used has protection in place, and that helps ensure that whatever has gone wrong is handled professionally and goes as smoothly as possible, even though we've just obviously had something that has gone wrong. So it's never nice for something to go wrong, I should say. But of course, when something does go wrong, you then want it to be handled as best as possible. So if there is an insurance policy in place with that particular vendor who was involved in that particular circumstance or incident that has occurred, you've got that as a safety net there for you.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because, again, I don't think that this is something that clients really think about, because
Correct.
a lot of the times, especially, in our industry, the event industry, we're talking about the perfect event and everything running smoothly and it's, amazing. And that's why you hire your vendors, so that things do go smoothly. But there is that margin for risk, like we kind of talked about. And so
we can't control everything, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's right. Sometimes the universe just has other plans for us. And, even just like a little side story, not directly related, but just on the weekend, I had my car battery break down right before I was going to deliver some bouquets and buttonholes. And it was just like, okay, like there's nothing I can do about this right now, but sometimes these things just happen. And so I think it's important to recognize that obviously, your vendors would be putting every measure in place to ensure that everything does run smoothly, but not everything always does. So what are kind of the potential risks or liabilities associated with hiring vendors who maybe don't have insurance?
Well, it means that if something does go wrong, there is an insurance policy there as a form to transfer that risk to. So it means that you're then going to have to rely upon, dealing with having that vendor engage in their own legal advice. And unfortunately, depending on how things are going with the business, their capacity and ability to, fork out those costs themselves could create some road bumps along the way for you. Whereas if an insurance policy is in place, that insurance policy is going to cover, their legal advice. So it means that you're going to, have things handled in a professional manner. And, the last thing that you want is for one of your guests to be, injured or have their property damaged or something along those lines. And, particularly injury, that's potentially their livelihood if they're not able to work. And if, the injury was as a result of some negligence on behalf of a vendor or potential negligence on behalf of a vendor, you'd want to make sure that your guests are being looked after. And that's a good way to make sure that does happen.
Yeah, 100%. Honestly, just like the fear that gets instilled in me, even just talking about this, is so unparalleled, because I'm like, oh my God, I never want something like that to ever happen. But like you said, like, let's just say, I'm putting in like a hanging installation or something like that, and it's in a marquee, and maybe, I don't know, maybe the marquee wasn't, put up correctly. It's like, it can all just kind of tumbleweed into this much bigger issue.
Absolutely. Particularly if you've got multiple vendors involved as well, that's where things can get complicated. And in some cases, the negligence could be shared among a couple of different vendors involved in the event. Like that example that you just suggested, obviously you're not putting up the marquee, but who's put up the marquee? So when there's so many moving components involved, it just helps make the process that little bit more smooth when something does go wrong, because then all parties have insurance in place and you've got peace of mind knowing that because they've got the insurance policy, they have appointed lawyers from the insurance companies that will investigate the matter and handle the matter and liaise with one another.
Yeah. And even, I know that there is, like, again, I just did an event on Friday in Melbourne, and a lot of venues now actually just request to see your, certificate and make sure that you are being compliant on that front.
That's right.
That the liability obviously doesn't, fall back on them, which I actually think is a really good thing, because from a client perspective, you again want to make sure that you are dealing with professionals and, people who are quality vendors. And so can you share any insights on how investing in quality vendors who do have that appropriate insurance can lead to a more positive event experience overall for clients?
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, it's a really good indicator that they are a professional and they are considering, what could happen and what could potentially go wrong. And they're putting those measures in place to ensure that they've got the support and advice that they will require to help manage that particular incident or whatever it is that may go wrong. Something else to touch on as well, which does sort of relate to insurance a little bit. I certainly can't provide any legal advice because I'm not a lawyer, but I think part of the process with engaging a quality professional vendor, they are going to have terms and conditions that they send through to you when you are obtaining a quote or proceeding with the booking. So in a lot of cases there will actually be a section within that terms and conditions document which might talk about insurance as well. So it's really good to review that over. And I think knowing that they've also just got terms and conditions for other matters relating to your event and to your booking and, what happens in this case and what happens, in this scenario, it's really important to be clear and upfront about that in the initial stages so that you are thinking about, okay, in the event that this occurs, cancellation or bad weather or, things like deposits, you're aware of what the process is, and as I said, if insurance is mentioned in there, it's really clear as to what insurance policies they have in place. And in some cases you might actually find that you as the client could potentially need to have certain insurances in place yourself. I wouldn't expect it with a florist, for example, but if you're hiring a venue, particularly if it was like an Airbnb venue or something along those lines, you've got to be really careful in checking those T's and C's because they could actually request that you have a certain type of insurance in place as the client as well as a condition of making that booking. And something also to be really careful of, this happens a little bit in commercial insurance, is sometimes when you are paying an invoice, there might be a little one-liner on there saying you're agreeing to our terms and conditions as per our website. Please, please, please go and check those terms and conditions. Again, I can't advise on any of the legal things, but there will be things in there that you do need to check on. And again, insurance might be something that's talked about in there as well.
100%. That is such great advice because, I know that I'm guilty of that. Just being like, yep, no worries, tick the box and on I go. And luckily, I've never had anything that's kind of come back to bite me, right? But it is almost like you see that everywhere. So you almost become a little bit immune to it almost.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it is also a really good opportunity to pick up those vendors that may be not as professional and as, a quality of vendor as what you thought. Because it's been interesting, me personally, when I've had to go, make bookings and that sort of thing, when I have actually gone and checked the terms and conditions, it's been a clear copy and paste job from another business because other business names completely unrelated to the booking have been listed in the terms and conditions. So that might be a red flag for you.
Absolutely. So it's definitely worth it. It's definitely worth taking that time.
Yes, for sure.
And you've just kind of mentioned just like one example there, but are there any other examples or scenarios where a client's interests are kind of safeguarded because their vendors that they've chosen have had insurance? Like, I'm sure you've probably heard some horror stories over the years and that kind of thing, but is there any that you can kind of share with us?
Well, it's more so in the event of protecting the safety of the guests. But interestingly, as I mentioned, there are some cases where clients may take out an insurance policy. So, for example, that might be a public and products liability policy. So what that's covering you for is in the event that one of your guests or a third party, which could even be a vendor could be, injured at your event because of, something that you've maybe, not done correctly or something along those lines. And then there are also other policies that cover things like, in the event that your event is cancelled for unforeseen circumstances, it can cover costs associated with cancellation for loss of deposits and those sorts of things. So I did actually have, this wasn't a client of mine, I wasn't a vendor whose insurance I was looking after, but I actually had a friend who had a wedding insurance policy in place, and that was an interesting one. She actually had not a very quality vendor. She had a wedding planner that took deposits, very large deposits for a destination wedding overseas, and then disappeared off the face of the planet. And yeah, luckily, this friend of mine did actually have a wedding insurance policy, which isn't common. I don't think a lot of people think about this. It was more so a bit of an afterthought because of the craziness that was happening after COVID. So thankfully, I was able to help her get that claim paid with the insurance company because she lost a significant amount of money. It was about a $15,000 claim payment that I managed to get for her. She was still out of pocket. I think she was out of pocket entirely $20,000, but it was $15,000 that we were able to recuperate. But that was an interesting one because she had insured directly with the insurer. She hadn't gone through a broker, and she had a lot of headaches with that particular insurance company. So although we got there in the end, it was, very complicated for her. And had she not been lucky enough to know someone that was an insurance broker, she absolutely said to me, there is no way that I would have got that claim paid because I just had no idea what I was sort of dealing with. So that's also something to consider if you are a client who's needing to take a policy out or considering taking a policy out. I would suggest speaking with an insurance broker to make sure that it is set up correctly. And then if you do have a claim, it's actually handled properly and you do, get the maximum benefit that you should receive, and the claim is actually accepted if it's a legitimate claim that's covered by the policy. So that was a very interesting one.
Yeah, that's unreal, honestly, because, you do hear about these things, like you do.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, not everybody is out there with the best of intentions, right?
No, that's right.
So, as much as we like to think that, we're hiring people who really do care and they want us to have the perfect day and all of these different things, it's not always the case. And,
No.
Even just kind of touching on the COVID thing, I feel like that was a massive shift for the industry as a whole, because all of a sudden it was like, we need to think about pandemics, like what?
Yeah.
But
yeah, I mean, as stressful as a time that was, that really proved to us that the unexpected can happen. Like, I think that is the epitome of the unexpected. Nobody saw that coming whatsoever. And it is what insurance is designed for, the unforeseen. But obviously, as a part of risk management, we can sort of sit there and think about, these are the potential things that could go wrong. But at the end of the day, that just proves that you're never going to be able to think about every single, potential eventuality that could occur.
Yeah.
So having something as a backup and a safety net to sort of catch you in those unexpected times, is definitely beneficial from a vendor and a client's perspective as well.
100%. And yeah, like I said, I don't think anybody saw COVID coming, so
Yeah.
it's only, again, we talk about like the universe had other plans, and, all we can do is just do our best. And sometimes you don't know what you don't know until it happens. So,
and insurance is like, I think like the poster kid for you don't know what until, you don't know what you don't know, essentially.
Exactly. And look, don't get me wrong when I say this, Casey, but insurance is probably not like the sexiest topic that everybody wants to talk about when they're talking about their wedding and their dream event and all these different things. But like you said, I think it just goes to show that, it is something that we do need to think about, even though it's probably not the first thing on our mind.
For sure. I mean, there have been some really horrible things in the media, relating to events that people have been hosting and, accidents happening on wedding days and that sort of thing, which that is, worst case scenario, but it does happen, unfortunately. So ensuring that you have a quality vendor that has insurance in place means that, if there was negligence on their behalf, your guests and even your other vendors or, whoever else is at that event is more likely to be looked after as they should, as opposed to someone not having insurance in place and then having this big mess to try and deal with themselves out of their own pocket as well.
100%. And so let's kind of talk about that a little bit, because I think we've talked about the fact that, you obviously want quality vendors who have quality insurance and all of those sort of things. But what kind of questions should a client be asking to ensure that their vendors do have appropriate insurance?
For sure. So really there's two insurance policies that would really come into play from a client's perspective. So if you are dealing with a vendor who is providing a product and service, or product and or service, or both of them, they should have public liability and products liability in place as a minimum. So what that's going to provide them with protection for is if you or another vendor or a member of the public or one of your guests hold them responsible for either injury to somebody or damage to somebody's property. And then secondly, the policy that also might need to be in place with the vendor is professional indemnity insurance. And that's if they're providing you with a service for a fee. So that could be, your event planning, your, design services, that sort of thing. So that's providing protection for that vendor if they make a mistake in providing that service. So if something goes wrong, if what they were supposed to provide on the day isn't provided, that policy will provide coverage for them in the event that they're held responsible for a financial loss. So they're the two policies to keep an eye out. But as a minimum, public and products liability for sure, because that's ensuring, the safety of everyone at the event in case someone is injured or if someone's property is damaged as well. When we're talking about events, depending on what event it is, but sometimes there's a really mixed bag of people there. We've got little kids running around, we've got the elderly, not hopefully not running around, but maybe. And then also, alcohol is involved quite a bit, and that can make it a little bit more of a risky situation, unfortunately. So there's lots of moving components, lots of things, that there are to think about, and more moving components means more opportunity for something to go a little bit amiss.
100%. And so I just want to touch a little bit on the design element that you just kind of talked about, because I think that really relates to the floristry world. Mm-hmm. Definitely, and I've spoken about this a lot with clients and on the podcast and other places as well, but when we're designing something to do with nature, there is that room that nature is not going to show up to the party exactly how you want it on the day. So, something like you said, the T's and C's, for example, in like my contracts today, like we're going to work to the colors, but we don't, guarantee specific flowers those sort of things. So I do believe that, with the designs specifically, like there is so much risk that is involved, particularly when you are working with something like nature.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, just design in general, someone's vision of what they want and then the ability to be able to deliver on that. Majority of the time I don't think there are issues with that. In some cases, I imagine you probably have clients who are like, oh my goodness, this is even better than I imagined. But I'm involved in a lot of, different Facebook groups for all sorts of different industries and those sorts of things. And you do hear about things going wrong where what was, agreed upon hasn't been delivered. And when it's, particularly when it's a really important day for somebody and something that they could have potentially been planning for years, or if they're one of those unlucky people that's had to, reschedule a particular event on numerous occasions and then wait for, spaces to open up with all the backlog of events to get through, it's something that can be a real letdown. And just because they have a professional indemnity insurance policy in place and because someone's not happy doesn't mean that the vendor has actually, done anything wrong. But it just means that if you do have a complaint from a client, or if you are a client with a complaint that does form into something quite serious or formal, with getting advice from a lawyer, that if the vendor's got a professional indemnity insurance policy in place, that is going to be dealt with in a professional manner. And on the flip side, if you're a vendor, that you've got the policy in place. So if, it push comes to shove and there is negligence on your behalf, or there was failure to deliver, or there was a mistake in the advice that you provided, that you've got the protection in place.
100%, because, especially with something like design, like you're trying to take what is in somebody's brain and translate it into something tangible. So I think there is a lot of dreaming involved, I often say.
For sure.
So I think there is so much room, like I said, for that error that, or that risk,
Exactly.
I suppose. But let's talk a little bit about red flags or like warning signs. We kind of
Mhm.
talked about which policies, vendors kind of should have at a minimum. What would you say to a client, if they're talking to a vendor and they're kind of saying some things, like what would you tell them to listen out for in terms of red flags or warning signs?
I think if you're actually approaching them and asking to, have a copy of the document that you would request if you were wanting someone to prove that they had insurance in place is called a certificate of currency. So it would be a red flag for me if I've requested that information and the vendor is kind of trying to dodge it, or maybe they flat out say, "Oh, I don't have insurance in place." Or they're coming up with excuses as to why they don't need insurance, or trying to say that, oh, no, the venue's got insurance in place, for example, or this person or the wedding planner's got the insurance in place. They would be red flags for me. As well as I mentioned before, if there weren't formal terms and conditions in place, or if you've got a question regarding a formal term or condition and they actually can't answer your question, or they can't explain the term or the condition to you, that would be a red flag for me. And if they are able to explain it to you, but it's maybe something that you're not comfortable with, or they just flat out say, no, we don't have insurance in place, and we're not going to organize it, I think then you've got to sort of make a decision on your gut in terms of how that makes you feel. Particularly if you're broaching insurance from the point of view to the vendor saying, the safety of my guests is, of utmost priority to me. So please provide a copy of your public and products liability insurance, or, if it's an event planner, for example, or as I said, someone who's providing design services, please provide a copy of your professional indemnity insurance just so I can make sure that we're safeguarded in case, something does go wrong.
Yeah. And look, I think you touched on a really good point, which is that, that might be a little bit of an uncomfortable kind of conversation, because I think it can very quickly transpire into something that maybe you weren't quite expecting, perhaps.
Mm.
So how would you recommend that they do kind of bring up the topic of insurance in a way that is obviously constructive and, really respectful to their vendor? Because, we obviously want to make sure that, we're approaching it with the best of intent.
Yeah. So I think it would be helpful if there are terms and conditions and it does mention insurance in there, you could say, hey, I can see that you mentioned insurance in place, just to dot the I's and cross the T's, because the safety of my guests and everyone involved in the event is a priority to me. Would you mind please kindly providing me with a certificate of currency just so that I can ensure that that is in place? Or you might have the terms and conditions and it's not mentioned in there. So that could be a good segue for you to maybe say, hey, I can't see it in there. I'm sure you've got it in place. And, as safety is a priority to me, and, the smooth running of the day is a priority, could you please provide, copies of your insurance? And then I suppose thirdly, you might be thinking, hey, haven't got your terms and conditions. What about insurance? Those sorts of things. And again, that's a decision that you need to make, I suppose, if if there aren't terms and conditions and there isn't any insurance in place, that's a decision that you need to make as a client as to whether or not you feel comfortable. If there's a off feeling in the tummy, probably a good idea to go with the gut. But yeah, I think in most cases, you're probably creating a bit, a mountain out of a molehill, and it's likely that they've got it in place and it's a matter of flicking it over. Because like you said, in a lot of cases, there are other vendors that request other vendors to provide proof of insurance. And in the event industry, it's really quite common for insurance to be a requirement to be able to provide their services or product. So it might just be someone that's new to the industry, or maybe someone that's running their business as a little bit more of a hobby rather than a professional service or product selling business. So
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And look, like, you hear about people who are like, yeah, I've got my auntie to make up, these bouquets, and, they're going to do a hanging install and all these different things. And,
yeah,
that is beautiful, of course. And like, we love the idea of, bringing our, community in, of course. But again, when we think about kind of the longer term effects that might have, or impact that might have on our event, the last thing I think you want as a client or somebody who's hosting an event is then to have this whole nightmare follow on from like the best day of your life.
For
And
sure. And, if your auntie is doing the install, if something does go wrong, the last thing that you're going to want is for her to potentially be footing, a big legal bill. And I don't know, when it is family, are you then going to be wearing some of that legal bill as well? So it's one of those things. Everything's fine until it's not. And everyone's happy with a verbal agreement and this is fine and this is what we'll do. But I see it all the time. Once something does go wrong, those verbal agreements are gone and out the window, and matters are very different, particularly if I think what are some of your arrangements are like 50 kilos that you suspend from the ceiling, right? Okay,
exactly. Like they're not exactly light.
Tell me how you're feeling after one of those falls on top of your head, and we'll see.
Exactly. And the thing is,
not that we are manifesting that at
all. No, that's not on the cards for us, not at all.
No.
But I do think too, like just the saga that can come after that as well. Like it just puts such a dampener on the day or the experience or whatever it is that you're having. And, you want people to be talking about your event because it was the best day ever, not because, some install fell on somebody and now they're going through this whole process. Like that is the worst case scenario, just not only for the person who it's fallen on, but for you to have to kind of work your way through that process and figure out who's responsible and what the next steps are and all of those different things. So
absolutely.
Can you share, are there any kind of resources or tools that, clients can use to help better understand the kind of importance around insurance in the event industry and really kind of navigating this whole thing, maybe before or after, I suppose, something happens?
Well, I think something that I was really excited about with this podcast is the fact that you are actually providing a resource yourself for clients and, vendors as well who maybe don't have insurance in place either. So unfortunately, there isn't a lot of resources around, and that's why it can be so hard to navigate. So I really take my hat off to you, Bree, for, talking about this and bringing this to front of mind. I know that that's been a big mission of mine with Sparksure in terms of helping business owners understand and be aware and educate them with insurance. So I think if you are a client who is a little bit unsure of what your vendor should be having, or whether or not you actually need to have anything in place for you, or whether you're considering, wanting to have protection if something were to go wrong in terms of, unforeseen cancellation, or the example that I gave you before, if you've got a event planner that disappears with your $20,000 deposit, there are insurance brokers available that will be able to help you navigate and sort of put the information to you to help you determine whether or not you should have a policy in place. And then if you decide that it is something that you do want to look into, they can help you organise some options, put the cover in place for you. And then if you are in the unfortunate situation of something going wrong, they'll help you manage the claim as well.
Amazing. That is so fantastic. And I guess just to kind of like wrap up today, is there anything else you'd like to share in terms of insurance or events or anything that, you think our kind of listeners should know?
Well, insurance is like we've sort of touched on. It does feel like quite the minefield. It does get a lot of bad press. And I think where the bad press comes from is when people are trying to do it alone, when you don't understand it. It's one of those things we mentioned earlier, you don't know what you don't know. So it's about being educated, and it's not something that we all learn about in school. I think there's a whole new curriculum that business owners would like to be put into the school system, because it would be really helpful if there were things that we knew before we got stuck into launching a business and dealing with all these new things that we don't normally deal with. So I think there's a real opportunity for you to sort of reach out to an insurance broker to help you navigate that. You don't have to go it alone. And there are people out there that can help you do that, and that would be an insurance broker.
Lovely. Thank you so much for coming on this podcast. I have actually loved this chat. And like I said, I don't think it's like the sexiest of topics, but when I hear about the stories and the importance of it and, making sure that the client is at the forefront and making sure that they are comfortable, I think there is just something about that feels right. And
yes,
that to me is like what it's all about. So is there anything else, like where can we find you? How do we get in contact if we do, want to talk about insurance or anything like that?
Absolutely. So you can reach out on my website. I've got an inquiry form there. Feel free to send the inquiry form through there or shoot me an email directly. I am on LinkedIn and I am on Instagram as well. So feel free to reach out if you do have any questions. And of course, if it's not something that I can help you with or Sparksure can help you with, at the very least, when I have people reach out to me, I do my very best to put them in touch with someone that can, or make some suggestions for some potential avenues that they can explore to be able to get the assistance that they need.
Amazing. And we will definitely leave all of those links in the show notes as well, so that, you know, people can reach out to you. And that's what makes me so obsessed with you, Casey, because even if you can't help, you're so willing to point people in the right direction. And yeah, I cannot recommend Casey, you know, enough, honestly. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of your insight and all of your knowledge. And like I said, I've personally got a lot out of this chat, so I'm sure everybody listening has as well.
Thank you so much for having me. And like I said, yeah, I was really excited to jump on and to be talking about how it impacts the client and not necessarily just the business owner. So